Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're digging deep into the elections of the United States. What happened, why did it happen, and what are the implications for politics in the coming years? Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. What should we make of this week's elections in the United States? Most people were expecting a fairly comfortable victory for Joe Biden, but in fact, in state after state has gone down to the wire. And still, as we record this on Thursday morning, the final result isn't certain. The Democrats were also supposed to win the Senate and make gains in the House, but neither of those things happened. So where are we in all of this? What do we know so far? And what explains such an unexpected set of outcomes? What can we expect the next 4 years to look like? And perhaps most fundamentally, what should we think about the state of democracy in the U.S. today? Joining me to explore all of these questions is UCL's very own crack team of U.S. political experts. Dr. Thomas Gift is Associate Professor of Political Science at UCL and Founding Director of the UCL Center on U.S. Politics. If you were listening to BBC's radio coverage as the election results came in, you will have heard him providing expert analysis throughout the night. Dr. Julie Norman is lecturer in politics and international relations and co-director of our Politics and International Relations program. She too has been providing expert analysis on a variety of platforms over the past week. And Dr. Colin Provost is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Director of our MSc in Public Policy. Welcome to all three of you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here. Thomas, if I can start off by asking you, it's Thursday afternoon here in London. What do we know about the results so far?
Well, I think the first point to note is that the race isn't settled yet, but it does look increasingly like it's tilting toward Joe Biden. According to the New York Times, right now, Biden holds a 253 to 214 advantage in electoral votes. Of course, a candidate needs 270 to win. Other states are still reporting, including Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, though some of those states have already been called. Out of the states that haven't been called yet, the trend lines look encouraging for Biden. I think it is worth underscoring that this wasn't always the case, however, and if you were watching closely on election night, there were a number of moments during the evening, particularly after Florida was called for Trump, where the president seemed to have a more legitimate path to victory. At this point, though, if Trump is going to win the race, I think it would almost certainly entail a protracted legal battle where he prevailed despite the odds. So with the data that we have, Biden's camp has to be quite confident that once all the votes are counted, he will be the president-elect.
And this isn't obviously in the US just about the presidential election, although most of the attention has been focused there. Rolling into the elections, it was very much looking like there was a potential blue wave of support that might flip the Senate to Democratic control. Colin, where do we stand on the outcome of the Senate election so far?
Yeah, so as you said, Jennifer, the Democrats were definitely optimistic about the Senate. The Republicans held a 53 to 47 edge coming into the election, but Democrats knew they were probably going to lose the seat in Alabama, Doug Jones' seat down there, which then meant that the Democrats would have to flip 4 seats in order to regain control of the Senate. They got part of the way there. They won back seats in Colorado and Arizona. But seats that they expected to win maybe handily in Maine and North Carolina, that hasn't materialized. In Maine, Susan Collins held on to win to defeat Sarah Gideon. The results of the North Carolina Senate race are still outstanding, but it looks, I think 99% of the votes are counted, and it looks as though Tom Tillis may hold on to beat his challenger, Cal Cunningham. And in Iowa, Joni Ernst held on to beat Teresa Greenfield, which Democrats also hoped that might be a pickup as well. So there are still open seats and there are still seats to be contested in Georgia. But there is a considerably more narrow pathway to a Democratic majority right now. It's looking as though the Republicans will probably hold on to the Senate.
And Julie, if we could turn our attention to the House of Representatives, is there a sense that the Democrats have also underperformed in the House given expectations?
Well, Jennifer, I would say that there is. Nancy Pelosi came out pretty early on election day and was pretty confident about Democrats. But in fact, the Democrats ended up losing seats in the House while the Republicans gained in a few unexpected upsets. So the Democrats lost about 5 seats with some races still in play right now. So the Democrats will hold the House for sure, but it's a smaller majority than they've had and definitely smaller than they thought they would have after this election. It's also notable, I think, to point out that the Democrats were hoping to flip some of the state legislatures as well. And so far, none of those went to the Democrats either. So the blue wave that I think Democrats were hoping for down ballot did not play out.
So we're 48 hours past election. Thomas, how unusual is it for a US election not to have a result, either on the night or very shortly thereafter?
Well, we can certainly think of high-profile examples where this has occurred before, and everyone kind of immediately gets flashbacks to 2000, Bush v. Gore, where that process dragged on for weeks. It was focused very much on one particular state, Florida. I think it is important to note that anytime we have an election, it does take time to certify and make those outcomes official. So this is not atypical in terms of the process extending beyond election day. Of course, the media and other news outlets will call the election in one direction or the other. But by and large, it is atypical. Usually we will know who the president is, if not the night of election day, at least in the following day. So we are in, if not unprecedented territory, at least a situation that is fairly anomalous relative to historical standards.
So given where we are, I think the next question is what happens next? And Trump has come out already and kind of claimed victory fairly early on the night. Joe Biden made a speech saying he hasn't claimed he's won yet, but wants to see out the process. And Colin, I think Thomas has already alluded to the idea that we do need to continue counting votes and certify them. But what are the next steps? How does this get resolved?
Right. So Trump has talked about how some of the ballots ought not to be counted in some places. And in some places, he has legally taken steps to try to accomplish that. So in Georgia, his campaign has filed a lawsuit demanding that the ballots not be counted from this point forward. It's unclear what the legal grounds are for doing that because the votes, as long as they come in up till election day, they should be counted. The law does not say anything about not counting after election day, obviously. He's filed a lawsuit as well in Michigan to stop counting there. But given that Michigan has been called, it's not quite clear what the ramifications of that are. In Wisconsin, his campaign has requested a recount, which he's legally entitled to do because the margin of victory for Joe Biden was within 1%. So we'll expect a recount in Wisconsin, although the precise timeline is a little uncertain there. And there are multiple legal challenges in Pennsylvania going on as well, brought by Trump's campaign as well as Republicans as well. So we'll see how these legal challenges unfold. But in the meantime, the counting will continue.
And Colin, if I could just keep on the issue here, and particularly around the Supreme Court, you will know that the Trump administration pushed through the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett right before the election. There was some sense that this and he signaled that he would go to the Supreme Court to decide the outcome of this. So what is the role of the Supreme Court? Can Trump make a case, or is that just simply more Trump rhetoric?
For the most part, the legal challenges that he brings are going to have to begin in the lower courts, right? And they might expedite those cases. They might put them front and center. But any case is usually going to have to work its way up through the 3 levels of federal courts up to the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court thinks there's a case there. If the district court and appellate courts are ruling, quite clearly that he does have a case or he does not have a case, or if he doesn't have a case, then the Supreme Court may just decline to take it up. Now, prior to the election, there had been a case in Pennsylvania where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided that there needed to be 3 extra days because of the pandemic. They were agreeing to a request from the Pennsylvania Secretary of State. There need to be 3 extra days to count ballots after Election Day. The Supreme Court went along with that. They felt they didn't really have time to look at it in depth, but some of the conservative judges on the bench felt that maybe there was grounds to to roll that back. So meaning that it was potentially going to be revisited after the election. So it's not clear what would come of that if it did make it to the Supreme Court again. It is possible that might occur. But I think it's important to remember as well with these legal challenges, even if the Supreme Court thinks that something illegal was going on with counting ballots in Pennsylvania, the way that the trend is going right now with multiple states going in Biden's favor, if Biden does end up winning a majority of these remaining outstanding states, it's not just one state that there's going to have to be a change to legally. It's going to have to be multiple ones. And the judges are going to be loath to throw out ballots in the first place or to nullify any results. So it's not totally clear what the end game is for the Trump campaign with some of these legal challenges. They can bring as many as possible, but it's going to require amazing legal changes to the results, changes that are just not likely to happen overall. So it's not clear that he's got a path that way to victory as well.
Which suggests we could be here for quite a long time, which again, then I think takes us further down to the unprecedented waters space. Julie, if I could come to you, there was a lot of discussion before the election about how certain demographic groups would split either for Trump or Biden. Suburban women were a key grouping that were looking to pivot towards Biden. African Americans were thought to support Biden very significantly, while Trump would maintain his base of support amongst white males and white females. What do we know about different groups and how they voted? And was there anything particularly surprising?
Well, Jennifer, in general terms, the trends went as we expected. Biden got the majority of women voters, of African American voters, Latino voters, and young voters. But I think what was surprising was the areas in which Trump made inroads with different groups. For example, as you mentioned, suburban women, white women in particular actually increased support for Trump by about 8% in this election. And even among Latino and African American women, Trump saw gains, as well as in terms of the African American vote in general. He got twice as many votes as he did last time in 2016, and also increased among Latino voters, which was very obvious in Florida, I think, with his victory there in the Miami area. And I think this underscores a couple of things. I think for both parties, just recognizing that the voter blocks that are sometimes talked about in rather lumped terms, the Latino vote, the Black vote, are actually quite diverse within them and need a lot more attention from both parties and how they are reaching out to voters. And the other area where there was a split that I would just point out is again in rural and urban. And even in some of the states that that Biden has flipped back, in Wisconsin and Michigan, the counties that he flipped in 2016 still held steady with his support. It's just that more support came out for Biden in the cities. So I think that rural-urban split is another demographic that both parties will need to be keeping a focus on in the future.
And Colin, Julie's talked about these different groups, and that these blocks aren't homogenous groups, that they will all vote in one way. We've seen here in the UK, particularly around Brexit, that kind of traditional left-right cleavages or groupings don't hold. In your view, what should we as social scientists, how should we start to understand these groups as we look towards Senate elections and House elections in another 2 years?
Right. That's a great question. I mean, Julie laid it out nicely talking about cleavages. And I think that before the parties can really understand what went wrong, what went right, they need to do a better job possibly of mapping out these cleavages as well. Going into the election, we may have thought that women were going to go much more for Biden than we thought. But as Julie pointed out, white women's support went up for Trump. We know that support among Hispanics went up for Trump in Florida, although maybe not necessarily elsewhere. But some data I've seen said that overall with Hispanic Christians, right, the religious element as well, support for Trump went up there as well. So there's a number of different dimensions there within gender, within race, religious status, socioeconomic status, that should be examined while keeping in mind that none of these groups are monolithic. You look at one big group and you realize that there's many more groups within that. And the demographics are changing in a number of states. And so it's something that both parties have to keep an eye on and have to study more in order to understand what their messaging should be in future campaigns.
Thanks, Colin. Thomas, we started off talking about a kind of an expected blue wave, that Biden would win quite handily, that might result in flipping the Senate, and certainly maintaining, if not gaining, numbers in the House. So the question that I'd like you to consider is the polls. Have the polls got it really wrong in this election? And if so, why?
Well, it seems to be the case this year that the pollsters did systematically underestimate Trump support and Republican support more broadly, not unlike in 2016. While it is true that some of the polls going into Election Day had the race as quite close in various swing states, I think few experts predicted that Trump would be as competitive as he was. In Florida, for example, Trump outperformed expectations by about 6 percentage points relative to 538 averages. I think that's non-trivial. Why is that the case? I'm sure that experts will do an autopsy into why these polls continue to miss the mark in terms of identifying both which voters will come out and how they will cast their ballot. Broadly speaking, though, I think that we should keep in mind that Trump is a very unconventional candidate running an unconventional campaign in an unconventional period. So against the backdrop of a pandemic and an economy that's swung dramatically in recent months, that just introduces a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and it's inherently harder to measure and assess Trump's popularity relative to a more conventional candidate in a landscape that isn't 2020. Some experts have also observed that there could be a significant number of so-called shy Trump voters who will cast their ballot for Trump in a secret ballot, but won't admit their vote choice to pollsters when they ask. That could also increase the size of the error bands. But regardless of what the cause here is, I think pollsters will certainly have to rethink assumptions and revisit some of their models in the wake of the ways in which they seem to be missing the mark.
So we knew in 2016 that there was shy Trump voters, and it wasn't expected that there would be shy Trump, the same extent of shy Trump voters in 2020. The polls also told us there were less voters who were uncertain about their choice as we went into this election. So if there are errors from polls, where is that coming in? Isn't it simply that they are missing Trump voters who aren't responding, who aren't picking up the phone when pollsters call them because they're less trustful of polls or simply don't want to participate? What do you think the source of the error is?
I mean, I think that it could be all of the above. And the bottom line is that it's fairly unclear at the moment. If pollsters thought that Trump voters were systematically less likely to respond to some of these polls, I think that the experts would have tried to bake that in to any kind of predictions that they were making, particularly given what happened in 2016. Because again, you could understand this anomalous situation happening once, but the fact that it happened twice and the fact that some of these gaps were so large, I do think points to, if not a failing of modern polling, at least some significant challenges and wrinkles that are going to need to be worked out. So again, I think that this is a conversation that political behavioral scientists are going to be discussing and talking about and looking at in length. I think to a large extent, these do become fairly technical questions about how you're capturing voters, measuring voters, and so on. And the bottom line is, I just don't know the answer to that question.
We've spent some time looking at the election and back at the election. Let's look forward a bit and talk about if it indeed is President Biden. Julie, can you talk us through what a Biden administration would look like in terms of domestic and foreign policy? I'm particularly interested in what you think foreign policy might look like under Biden, particularly questions around climate and healthcare.
Sure. So in terms of foreign policy, I think the most substantial difference we'd see between Biden and Trump is just a complete change of style and focus, a pivot from Trump's America First approach to one that's more traditional and one that we'd expect from a candidate like Biden, much more focused on multilateralism, working closely with our allies, re-engaging with things like the Paris Climate Accord, with the Iran nuclear deal, with the World Health Organization, and really just projecting a much more predictable and stable foreign policy than we've seen under Trump. But with that said, some of Trump's actual policies, such as being tough on China, trying to bring troops home from some of the engagements in the Middle East and Afghanistan in particular, those are things that I think we'll see Biden still pursue, but just in a much more, again, more stable and much more cooperative way with our allies and also with our own military and security. On the policy level, both one that stretches across both foreign and domestic policy, I think the biggest shift we'll see is in climate policy from Biden. He has indicated that he will sign back onto Paris, but also just domestically. Under the Trump administration, Trump has rolled back about 125 different regulations regarding the environment and climate, and there are several dozen others that are still in the works. Those are things that Biden will be looking to unwind those decisions and try and put those things back in place. He'll also, of course, be looking to try and push through some kind of legislation that would tie climate to the economy and to job growth. I think that will be a little bit trickier if the Democrats don't get the Senate, but there are still other regulations that he can put in place just through the executive branch. Elsewhere, I think, again, Biden will really double down on healthcare, trying to make some progress there. But again, if the branches are split, if he doesn't have a really strong support in the Senate, that might be more difficult for him as well.
Julie, you just picked up on healthcare there, and Colin, you've been watching and tracking the debate around Obamacare in the US. What do you think the status will be of Obamacare and healthcare policy should we have a Biden administration?
Right. So here's where the Republican control of the Senate, potential Republican control of the Senate, would really matter again in healthcare and climate. But in 5 days, the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments again on the Affordable Care Act, on the most recent challenge to it. And one thing that Joe Biden could have done, a prospective President Biden could have done with a Democratic Congress, is to go in and change the legislation a little bit of the tax cut passed in 2017 that basically enabled this most recent challenge. That tax cut passed by the Republican Congress basically zeroed out the penalty for not having health insurance, right, which holds up the individual mandate part of the Affordable Care Act, right? So Republicans thought they could bring a new legal challenge on those grounds. If there was Democratic unified control of the executive branch, or executive and legislative branches, then they could have changed that legislation to basically render that legal challenge moot. But he won't be able to do that with a Republican Senate, and he's more just has to kind of take a more wait and see attitude with what the Supreme Court does. Now, the Supreme Court may decide to strike down the whole law. Or they also have the possibility of what we call severing the individual mandate from the rest of the law, which would be something that would largely allow people to keep their health insurance and just getting rid of the individual mandate part of it. So some of the questions directed at Amy Coney Barrett during her confirmation hearings were specifically about severability, almost to signal to other people that this was to apply possibly to the Affordable Care Act. I think the Senate will also matter with regard to Joe Biden's climate aspirations, right? He would like to do not a Green New Deal exactly, but he would like to do a very significant, very large $1 trillion infrastructure plan to help what's currently the cratering economy that's very much also devoted to clean energy production and creating jobs in clean energy as well. With a Republican Senate, it's obvious that he's not going to be able to spend nearly as much. There's going to be a lot of obstacles in his way there. He's going to have to find ways to work with him in that regard. So, and also with a Republican Senate, it's going to be very difficult, virtually impossible to pass any comprehensive legislation on climate change. He's going to have to do what Barack Obama did for most of his presidency, which is more rulemaking within the executive branch. And you can get quite a bit done there. But the problem is Biden would also be dealing with a federal judiciary that's been heavily influenced by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump over the last few years. So his people in the Environmental Protection Agency will have to work very carefully to write rules in a way that will make them not as susceptible to legal challenge further down the road. One more thing about Biden's climate policy, I say, is that Barack Obama was very concerned with the issue of environmental justice when he was president, the idea that we have to do something about the disproportionate impacts of pollution and toxic waste and this sort of thing upon people of color and impoverished people. And so this is something that Joe Biden even referenced in one of the debates and is almost certain to get more attention. And he's mentioned that he will allow different communities direct access to the White House in order to address these problems, since pollution does have disparate impacts. So there are things that he can do specifically within the executive branch. There's plenty he can do, but it doesn't mean they won't be susceptible to legal challenge. And it's just there's not as much he can do without a Democratic Senate.
Colin, you've really helpfully highlighted some of the kind of institutional blockages or constraints that a potential Biden administration will face. But I want to turn our attention to thinking about the challenges of this particular election for American democracy. Some of the events, some of the statements, some of the rhetoric that we have seen and observed in the run-up to the campaign is not typically part of American elections. And there have been challenges to Donald Trump's more authoritarian style of rhetoric. Thomas, if I could come to you and get your reflections, what is going to be the legacy of this particular election for American democracy? And how will a very polarized US electorate respond?
Well, I think that it will be defined in large part by the fact that there was such a large portion of Americans who mobilized behind Donald Trump, even despite all of the controversies and provocations that we have seen over the past 4 years. It suggests that, irrespective of the fact that Donald Trump really has challenged basic democratic norms, including around elections, that a significant number of Americans are going to support that. That's based on a few things: populist appeal, Donald Trump's celebrity image, but also I think his capacity to resonate with some of the less savory impulses of many Americans. If we think about this more broadly, there is just tremendous amount of polarization in the United States right now. Donald Trump has certainly not done anything to help mitigate that challenge. If anything, I think he has reinforced those divisions and made them more salient. So it does present a very significant challenge for whoever the next president is, assuming that's Joe Biden, to heal those wounds. Joe Biden has promised to do that, but in some respects, these divides are so baked into the American electorate, they're so deeply ingrained that it's going to be difficult for any president, even one who is intent on bringing the country together, to undo.
Julie, if I can come to you on that question. We saw images of shops being boarded up the nights and the weeks before the election, particularly in Washington, D.C. And that is not something that we typically associate with U.S. elections. Can U.S. political institutions survive these challenges?
Well, Jennifer, I think that they can. And it was, of course, notable that even those kinds of precautions were being taken before this election, but they were just that, precautions. And I think it's notable that despite the very real divisions and polarization that Thomas was alluding to, at the same time, on Election Day, almost all voting and voting processes went forward without incident. There were protests, there were demonstrations, but there wasn't any kind of descent into violence or any of the more alarming kind of incidents that we had been potentially worried about. And I also just think that the large turnout in this election, the unprecedented high levels of voting from over a century, that is just an indication that Americans do still believe in electoral processes, do still believe in their institutions, and they want to show their political expressions in that way, and not just through other forms that we would see as less desirable. So if anything, I'd see it reaffirming a faith in those institutions if we can weather this current period of waiting out the results.
We started this podcast talking about the uncertainty of the results, and Colin, I'll give the final thought to you. We're not anywhere near getting this resolved, particularly as you've noted with the various options for legal challenges. What and how will that affect American democracy? And what do you think is going to be the challenge for both potentially President Biden or President Trump to really shape that narrative until we find a resolution?
I mean, well, with the immediate challenge, we're talking about those who might, decide the election, looking at judges and this sort of thing. I think that they are going to be loath to do anything that is seen to be interfering with the democratic process, right? So I don't expect, I mean, if the electoral votes go Joe Biden's way, it would be very surprising to see any sort of judicial outcome that manages to swing that in a different direction. In the longer run, I broadly agree with what both Thomas and Julie mentioned, that first of all, there's a lot of support for Donald Trump, which I think surprises the part of the American population that doesn't support Donald Trump, right? A lot of times during the last 4 years, people would say, okay, now it's the Russia investigation. This time, he's really done for, or now it's Ukraine. Now he's really done for. And the support was always there. It wasn't an overly high level of support, but it was large enough to really matter, around 40%. And this seems surprising to a lot of Americans, because this kind of taps into what political psychologists refer to as the authoritarian personality, people who really value obedience and traditional norms and maybe fear diversity and freedom a little bit more. And those aren't my terms; those are terms used in the literature to go over these things. So that's an interesting angle, and it really raises the question of if Trump is done now, who would the Republican candidate be in 2024? Surely it's got to be somebody who has some element of Trumpism as well. There are those who think maybe the Republican Party would become more moderate as a result of this, but I don't really see how that can happen when you've seen moderate members of Congress often face primary challenges, and the pull tends to be further to the right, and there's not really, it's hard to see how that would stop happening here. So for Joe Biden, he's got to work potentially with a Republican Senate. This would usually be the time that you say, okay, well, I've got to be bipartisan and I've got to find a way to work across the aisle. But it's not clear how much reward there will be for that sort of tactic, right? Barack Obama found that he had to do basically a go-it-alone strategy with a lot of executive orders and rulemakings between 2010 and 2016. And I suspect that that's what Joe Biden's going to have to do a lot of as well, unless he can find a few Republican senators to peel off and work with him. But Mitch McConnell is pretty good at enforcing discipline within his party. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how far President Biden would be able to get with those tactics. So it's going to be difficult to unify the country given where things are going and the potentially lasting legacy of Donald Trump and how he's raised a lot of these issues to the fore.
Well, we're going to leave it there. This has been fascinating. Thank you very much to Thomas Gift, to Julie Norman, and to Colin Provost for your expertise and your insights. And no doubt you will be continuing to talk about this over the next days and weeks. Next week is Reading Week here at UCL. So UCL Uncovering Politics will be taking a little break. But we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time when Alan Rennick will be speaking with our colleagues Inken von Borschakowski and Adam Harris about voter information. There has been a lot of concern about the quality of information available to voters during the US election campaign, as well as recent campaigns in the UK and other democracies. But Inken and Adam focus their research on information available during elections in emerging democracies. Democracy promotion organizations tend to assume that increasing the information available is a good thing, but Inken finds that this may not always be the case. So do look out for our podcast in 2 weeks' time when all will be revealed. In the meantime, can I encourage you to subscribe to UCL Uncovering Politics? You can do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you very much for listening.